All right, so what I want to talk about now is this framework called Enactivism and embodied cognition. So, what essentially is enactivism and what is embodied cognition? So, first of all, enactivism comes out of the theory of embodied cognition. Enactivism emerges out of the theory of embodied cognition. What is the theory of embodied cognition? Well, it's the theory that what we call cognition is not just a matter of what's typically called information processing, where some environmental signal is transduced as energy, into the eye, it goes into the brain, and it's processed. And cognitive activity is essentially consigned to this set of transductions from the environmental signal to a mental representation in the brain. Instead, it says that cognition is actually distributed across the soma, or the body, of the agent. And in fact, you cannot conceive of cognition in isolation from the entire agent. Now, there are a few things that are entailed in making that assertion. So the first thing that is entailed in making that assertion is that cognition is not just a matter of information processing in the brain, but rather that information processing is distributed across the body, in the sense that the nervous system is distributed across the body, but also in the sense that the nervous system is not an isolated system in the body, but it's interacting with the endocrine system, right, that produces hormones and other systems in the body. And as we will see later, emotion and cognition in this theory are actually deeply intertwined or embedded. So that's the first thing, is that cognition is distributed. We can't isolate it or localize it in its totality. So, of course, there are functions that are localized in the brain and functions that are localized elsewhere, but we want to say that cognition as a whole process involves the entire body. So in asserting that, we also have to take into consideration then movement of the body, right? And so movement, and what more generally can be referred to as action, is something that the body does, right? Something that the body does in order to achieve its ends. So embodied cognition takes into consideration that all information processing isn't happening in some passive, Cartesian, Descartes contemplating manner, rather that it's a function of bodily movement, motility, it's of action. And as we'll see later, action can be thought of in the simplest terms. It can be thought of as movement, right? The organism is foraging for food. The organism is avoiding predators. So it is approaching certain things and it's avoiding other things. And as we'll see later, these approach and avoid behaviors are actually scaffolded on more refined information processing, even when, for example, we are browsing the internet or we're moving towards some attractor state, some informational state that we are looking for, and avoiding others. So there's a selection process. So simply put, movement then becomes a big part of it, and therefore embodied cognition takes information processing, perception, as being in continuous loops with action. So perception, cognition, and action are always happening together. So that's what embodied cognition in a nutshell means. And so now we'll get to enactivism in a second. But as what we have said so far takes into consideration the entire organism, as we said. So the question then arises, what is the organism as a whole. And this is where enactivism kind of comes in, is that we want to be able to have a formal description of what is an agent, all right? And informally, colloquially, typically, when we think of an agent, you think of a living system. You think of living beings, beings that move and do things, right, of their own accord. And so what enactivism essentially wants to do is it wants to ground agency in living systems, but it wants to formalize what it is that we mean by living systems. And it tries to do that by recourse to this term that we'll call self-organizing systems, self-organization. So this is a very sort of hot term of art. It's been employed academically probably since the 60s and the 70s, and it's a very attractive term. But what does self-organization mean? That's the question. And what we'll say is that self-organization is when a system in nature differentiates itself from the environment around it. That's a very, very general description. So, for example, a tornado can be thought of as a self-organizing system, because the tornado, by virtue of its internal dynamics, right, it creates a system, it creates a barrier or a boundary between the tornado itself, where there is a concentration of heat, and the surrounding environment, where there is a different sort of thermodynamic states. So, and I'm bringing this term thermodynamic into play here, and I'll explain that later. But essentially, the self-organizing system is a system that propels itself out of some sort of internal dynamic or some naturally occurring dynamic into a non-thermodynamic equilibrium state. All right? And what do we mean by non-thermodynamic equilibrium state? Well, we mean a state where there is a concentration of heat, right? There's a level of organization that is different from the level of concentration of heat in the surrounding environment, right? So there is a distribution of entropy. Now, of course, in nature, you have all kinds of distributions of heat, but the law of entropy tells us that the total entropy of any system always increases. And what that means is that in terms of the second law of thermodynamics, heat always moves from, or rather, heat always moves from less, or rather from more heat, more movement in terms of particle dynamics, to less movement, or to rather the concentration of heat dissipating, right? It's always dissipating, it's always homogenizing. So in any system, whether it is, we can call it thermodynamically closed or thermodynamically open, and by closed we mean it can mean something like it exchanges energy with the environment. It can mean it exchanges energy and matter with the environment. We can mean that it exchanges both energy and matter. Now, that exchange ensures that systems always tend towards a dissipation of their thermodynamic non-equilibrium toward thermodynamic equilibrium, right? And so the tornado eventually dissipates. It ceases to exist. So now the question arises, how could you distinguish between a tornado and a system whose dynamics are such that it's organized in a way that it always reproduces its internal dynamic, its internal organization, such that it's differentiated from its external environment or external system. And enactivism seeks this answer in what is known as autopoiesis. Autopoiesis. And we need to define what we mean by autopoiesis. And essentially we mean a system that instantiates the necessary and sufficient conditions, the following necessary and sufficient conditions. A, the system produces a semi-permeable boundary between itself and the environment. By semi-permeable, we mean that the boundary is such that the system is differentiated from the environment, but it also exchanges energy and matter with the environment. B, the boundary is reproduced by a network of reactions within the system. And C is that A and B are recursively interdependent, which means that the boundary is a condition for the possibility of the reaction network occurring, whereas the reaction network occurring is also a condition for the possibility of the boundary being reproduced. So these two are recursively dependent upon each other. These three conditions, the autopoietic thesis claims, are necessary and sufficient for an autonomous, what we'll call an autonomous system. The paradigmatic autonomous system that occurs in nature is something like a cell. It can be the simplest type of cell, right? It can be a prokaryotic cell without a nucleus, but it is the cell. And so what sets the cell apart from the tornado is that it has this set of dynamics that the cell is able to have a reaction network, and now the tornado has a reaction network, but the tornado doesn't produce a boundary that is resilient enough, right, so that it can keep reproducing itself, right, indefinitely. So that's the idea. The idea is that we want a description of an autonomous system, and an autonomous system is such a system that it self-organizes an internal milieu, right, through its organization. And what we'll do is we'll call that organizational closure. So organizational closure will refer to the self-referential network of relations that define the system as an organizational whole or a unity, such as a cell, and we'll define another term here is operational closure, which is the reentrant recurrent dynamics. What I was talking about is that recursive dependency. Okay, so the tornado has the reentrant recurrent dynamic, but it doesn't have the closure, right? It doesn't have the closure. And the closure is basically the interdependence of the boundary and the reaction network. Now, of course, in a living system, the reaction network is metabolism, is the consistent, constant coding for proteins, and what the proteins do is they build the system, including the boundary, in a way that the system, right, differentiates itself from the environment. So, enactivism takes autopoiesis as its grounding theory, right? To define autonomous systems. So, to recapitulate what we have just said, self-organizing systems do occur in nature, but they tend to not last. They tend to dissipate. They are not organized in such a way that they persist. A case in point being a tornado. There are other types of self-organizing systems that occur naturally, but eventually they dissipate. So we need a description for a type of system that persists, that has an internal engine that enables it to persist against the constant movement or the constant threat of thermodynamic equilibrium. And such a system are living systems. And what distinguishes living systems from non-living systems are these three conditions: the semi-permeable boundary, the internal reaction network, and the recursive interdependency of these two. So now, once we have autopoiesis, right? This theory was put forth by Varela and Maturana in the 70s, 73 to 79, 80. What the enactivist framework does is that it combines this with embodied cognition and certain theories of experience that stem from the school of philosophy known as phenomenology. And what phenomenology does is that it attempts to describe the first-person experience of the person in relationship to its environment. Now, there are different ways of framing phenomenology. So the founder of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, not sure if I have phenomenology here. The founder of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, wanted phenomenology to be a science of first-person experience, and he thought that he could do this by a mental exercise known as the phenomenological reduction, whereby the agent suspends belief in an external world of independent things, but rather directs their attention to how things appear. And the aim of this exercise, the purpose of the intention of this exercise, was to foreground invariant structures of consciousness, invariant structures of how things are actually disclosed in experience. So it is sort of a self-reflexive exercise of drawing attention to how things appear rather than sort of taking this everyday stance that we have towards experience, which is that it's transparent. It's always referring, it's transitive toward some object that is out there. And then his student, Martin Heidegger, and there are disagreements about this, but some interpretations of Heidegger take Heidegger to invert what Husserl aimed, which was to say that phenomenology is not this reduction or this suspension of belief in an external independent world, but rather it is taking as things show up without this exercise, as it show up in everyday experience in that meaningful way, as they show up meaningfully, as the proper object of phenomenology. So the proper object of phenomenology isn't this sort of removal exercise, but it is the opposite. It is trying to reveal how things show themselves without this step of trying to remove ourselves. It is how things show up when we are immersed. And so what Heidegger ended up saying is that in everyday life, we are always immersed in some set of circumstances, relations, concerns, concernful dealings as he called it, or other. There's always some mode of engagement. You have his famous hammer example, right? You have the worksmith using the hammer or hammering, the carpenter hammering, but you also have the example of human-computer interaction where we are engaged with these devices. And what Heidegger says is that the most basic state of what he called being in the world And by being in the world, he means something like the agent and the environment are not distinct things in this immersed everyday experience, but they're rather coupled. They are one and the same. The agent is defined by its relationships, its actions in this world as it appears to her or him or they or them, how it appears to them. So he called this being in the world. He called it being in the world. So to be an agent is to always be in a world of concern. And the world of concern for Heidegger is some salient action. So, in a certain time period, you might be engaged in a different activity. In our current modern period, we are interacting with computers, with computational devices, with other technological extensions. But essentially, it is this sort of interaction that is almost transparent. It is not something that you put intentional or mental effort into. It's something that is almost second nature, this interaction. And this kind of agent-environment coupling is what we'll call sensory-motor coupling in the Enactivist framework. So the Enactivist framework takes this sort of Heideggerian, Husserlian insight that the agent isn't, as Western philosophy describes the agent, kind of passively contemplating the external reality, but rather the agent in its paradigmatic state is not contemplating, but it's engaged in some salient mode of action. And the salient mode of action, the rest of the environment is transparent to them, and they are sort of immersed, they are coupled with the objects of their concern. Okay, so far so good. So we've gone from autopoiesis, right, describing an autonomous agent, to trying to describe things from the top down, from a phenomenological perspective, right? So we've described the bottom up, which is this autonomy, and then we've described the top down, how things actually tend to appear. And what the Enactivist framework does is it tries to integrate, it tries to marry these two descriptions. It tries to say that the autopoietic conditions, necessary and sufficient conditions for agential autonomy, are the conditions that make possible what phenomenology describes. Now, you might be asking, how is it that, does a cell have phenomenology? How is it that you go from a cell, right, the minimal autopoietic system, to a human being who has, thought and ideas and language and technology and all these other cognitive and technological extensions? And the idea is that a human being, another living, is also an autopoietic system. It's a complex autopoietic. It's what Evan Thompson, who is one of the foremost thinkers in this field, in this area, calls a second-order autopoietic system. So a first-order autopoietic system would be a cell, the simplest living system, and then a multicellular organism would be a second-order autopoietic system. So any multicellular organism is a second-order. We are second-order autopoietic systems. And the idea is that, and here is the kind of upshot of how everything comes together. Once you have this organizational closure, once the conditions for autopoiesis are instantiated in nature, what happens is that you have a system. an emergent system in nature that is not indifferent to its environment. It is a system that has an internal preference for certain states over other states. Right? So, right from the get-go, the cell, and this is observed in biology, the cell has preferences, right? It moves, it has movements, it has an engine, that it moves in its environment to seek nutrients, to seek environmental material that will cause it to take in energy, so it can break down, so it can synthesize proteins, right? And it has mechanisms where it avoids states that are detrimental to its survival. Now, we don't know the intricacies of how these preferential systems are constituted physically, but the idea is that a cell, already an autopoietic system, constitutes an emergent system that has an intrinsic normativity to it. All right? And what we called earlier sensory motor coupling, we'll call here normative coupling. So a cell is a normative system. And of course, you scale the cell to something like a human that has what we'll call human differentia, and these are properties or features that distinguish us broadly from other species and proximate species. Right? We have language. We are ultra-social. By ultra-social, we mean that we're extremely cooperative. We act in such a way that we reproduce the larger societal scheme. Or we're ultra-social. We have language, and we have higher order thought. We have these mental contents, and we have self-consciousness that other organisms may or may not have. So the idea is that the normative coupling scales all the way to human beings, and the idea is that consciousness is on a continuum. It's continuous with that kind of sensitivity that the cell displays to the world, in the sense that it avoids and approaches, right? It has a built-in intrinsic normativity, a normativity that arises out of its self-organizing dynamics. And so that intrinsic normativity is on a continuum, is how sensation scales across the scaffolding of complexity to a system like us, all the way to consciousness. So consciousness is in some continuity with being sentient. Sentience is kind of a more simple manifestation or form of consciousness. So the idea is that there is a continuity there, right? We share the intrinsic normativity with all other autopoietic systems. All right, so far so good. So we're kind of saying that there is this normativity, and how is this normativity related to phenomenology is the question. And the normativity is in fact related to phenomenology because, and we'll invoke Heidegger here. So for Heidegger, the agent, what he calls Dasein, being there, translated from the German, the agent is always in some state of moving or doing something that is normatively salient to the agent, right? It's always doing something, and Heidegger calls this, in terms of his hermeneutico-ontological framework, care. The agent is anchored in its environment through this care structure. And of course, you have the colloquial meaning of the term care, right? Do you care about something or do you not care? But what Heidegger means by care is, more formally, he means normative coupling, which means that things matter. Things matter to the agent. Things matter. It's always in some mattering relation. And the mattering relation is that you are not indifferent to your environment. Now, of course, it can come that you can feel indifferent to it, but this indifference that you might feel is just one facet, another facet, or a temporary facet of the larger care structure, the larger container that modulates the relationship of the agent to its environment. So the relationship of the agent to the environment is always circumscribed or defined by this relationship of care. All right? So we have these higher order, these kind of like higher level descriptions at the phenomenological scale, and then we have this lower order bottom-up description from this autopoietic framework. And it seems that what we're trying to do is we're trying to integrate the two together. We're trying to show that the description at the higher level is actually consistent with what we discover is actually happening at the most basic level of organization, and also that the most basic level of organization, the autopoietic organization, in fact has explanatory power with respect to why we experience the world as we do at the phenomenological scale, at the higher scale of how things show up meaningfully to agents. So now the next leap that we need to do is relate these insights to the information world, relate these insights to the information world in which we live in today. And what is the information world in which we live in today? It is the world of human-computer interaction. The information world in which we live in today is the world of human-computer interaction because human beings are now always, or more or less, in constant interaction with the computational devices, and social interaction, skillful interaction, these are all now mediated through computation. So there's a few things that relate to this basic description. So you can think of, phenomenologically, you can think of an agent in a prior epoch, before the advent of computers, as interfacing with the world through tools, through books, language, other people, social worlds, interacting with other people. But you can also, and that's one way that the human agent interacted with the world, right, in a way in which it had agency, right? The environment afforded the human agent certain things. It afforded the agent interaction with other human beings. It afforded making friends, building romantic relationships, and so on and so forth. And it afforded other things like degrees, reading, writing, all of these things. And I'm using this term affordance, which comes from James Gibson. And he used the term affordance to mean more, basically, more physical features of the environment and what they afford the organism in terms of action and movement. But we can scale that idea of affordance all the way to more symbolic or abstract aspects of the environment, because the environment is in fact stratified or layered with affordances that are symbolic, right? Such as reading. Being able to read is an affordance that isn't merely physical. It requires a kind of information processing that is more sophisticated than merely grasping or being able to walk over something or eating it, and so on and so forth. So there's a symbolic stratum there that is layered on top of the environment. That's just one example, right? And so what ends up happening is that these motor affordances that we have, you touch the mouse, you type in the keyboard, are ways that we mediate action now, right? To socialize, to create, to be creative, to be productive, to write, to create, to code algorithms, to purchase things online, to date online, and so on and so forth. So the affordance network now isn't what Gibson would have described as the ecological affordances, but they're extensions of these ecological affordances, but they're virtually constituted in these virtual systems, in user interfaces, and so on and so forth. In user interfaces and so on and so forth. So the idea is that, what is the idea? Why did we talk about the self-organizing and autonomy? Well, we talked about it because in order for an autonomous system has certain what we'll call viability conditions. And these viability conditions might appear to be merely physical, in the way, for example, that in a way that a cell maintains its physical integrity, right, by procuring nutrients, avoiding harm, being able to metabolize, create its, cell membrane, and so on and so forth, and it sort of like chugs along and reproduces its conditions and therefore its identity across time, right? But the viability of the cell, right, the viability conditions of the cell are just that it reproduce its physical instantiation. But the viability of, when you scale it all the way to more complex species, like mammals that are social, that have a lot more complex forms of information processing, and you scale all the way to humans who are ultra social and have tools and have language, viability is its ability to find an environmental niche, a states in the environment where the agent, the autonomous system, will be validated or will be able to exercise some normative will be able to exercise its sort of normative wants and have them met. So this brings us back to the comparator model, where the agent seeks to instantiate its internal norm, its preferred state in the environment. Now you ask yourself, well, what is an internal norm, right? What is an internal norm? Okay, that's a good question. So an internal norm is a state of preference that comes from the organism, from the agent itself. It's a state that comes from the agent itself. All right, where the agent, in acting out that norm in the environment rewards the agent. And that reward then strengthens the structure of pursuing those subset of states that create more and more reward. All right, so yeah, this is getting into some sort of psychological conditioning and so on and so forth, but it's more than that, because psychological conditioning is all about conditioning an agent to conditioning a behavior towards some set of states over other sets of states. But here what we mean is that the agent produces the norms themselves from the inside. All right? And so this is made manifest in the myriad ways that people pursue a vocation in life. Right? You'll have someone who finds their niche, their reward, their environmental niche, and this is a term from evolutionary biology, but you can also transpose it into human systems or human society, finds their environmental niche by making tutorial videos on YouTube. Right? It is a mode of being in the world where they exercise agency in a way that the environment rewards them, where there is some sort of success conditions, and the success conditions are in part defined by are defined by the social structure, but the meeting of internal norm of the autonomous agent and environment is such that the agent carves this niche, or even begets it, generates it, or cleaves it in the environment, such that the environment says that here you belong, or this is where you are viable. All right, so we conceive of viability. You extend viability from mere physical integrity, right? You have to eat, you have to exercise, to that which you do in the world, right? Where you use the highest functions, the highest capacity that you have, that potentially rewards you. And this obviously is functionally equivalent or identical to typically in human a vocation, a job, a profession, right? But it doesn't just have to be that. It can be things that you pursue outside of the job, because oftentimes the jobs are such that they are too rigid in what they ask of the agent, such that the internal norm of the agent has no space to be realized in the vocation. So autonomy is not just the viability in material terms, but the viability in broader societal terms, but also in terms of what the agent wants to bring into the environment, and it tries to find a niche in the environment that will permit that preference, that the creative artist or the mathematician or people have different ways of finding their niche of what they're good at in the environment. All right, so the idea is that viability is, in the most basic physical sense, continuous with viability in this other sense, which is maintaining yourself in an equilibrium where you are continually motivated to act in the world. And why this matters is because these systems in the world that we have produced, in the environment of computational affordances we have produced, constantly undermine this realization. The realization of this autonomous norm-producing, internal norm-producing viability is constantly disrupted in the modern world. It is also uniquely augmented, right? We see that there are people that are able to use these computational devices to augment their sense of agency, to have a sense of control over the environment where they produce things, they act out, and they put things in the world that then reward them, that bring back, whether it's monetary reward or it's recognition and so forth. But also at the same time, we find that these systems are such that they can co-opt this movement towards preferred states by derailing this goal-directed action. They can derail goal-directed action. And the whole point of invoking and trying to talk about the enactivist framework is that the enactivist framework gives us the best description that we have. It gives us the best description that we have of human autonomy and of what it's like to act in a world in a way that the agent is at equilibrium not only with themselves but with a broader sociality, with a broader social world. Okay. And so far, so good there. And broader sociality or social world. All right. Now the other important thing about enactivism is that it cushions autonomy in what it calls 1, dynamical systems theory, and 2, developmental systems theory. All right. So what is dynamical systems theory? Well, dynamical systems theory is the idea that a self-organizing system, as we have described it, is always a system that is time-dependent. It is a time-evolving system. So it is a continuously evolving system. So the idea is that the dynamics of self-organization in the autopoietic systems as a multicellular scale all the way to a dynamical system as a human agent where you are constantly, right? You are constantly in a mode, in a temporal state where you are effectuating what I would call, in a pithy way, recursive self-maintenance. So you're constantly in a way where you're trying to maintain yourself, right? And to maintain yourself, it requires that you act. And of course, there's rest, but you also have to act, right? So there is a constant, continuous time loop and looping of action and rest and what those actions do that subserve the agent's ends. All right, so those actions subserve the agent's ends. So one of them is the dynamical systems theory, and why this matters is that oftentimes agents and cognition are thought of in computational terms. And in computational terms, right, by analogy to computers, but also by analogy to how a computer architecture works, right, which is that its temporal dynamics are discrete time dynamics. The computer is always in some discrete time, and it doesn't really have continuous time in the way that a naturally occurring system does, right? So temporal measurement in the computer, even though it's really fast, it's at bottom, it's discretized. Whereas the cognitive dynamics, the information processing of a living system, cannot be thought of in that way. And it doesn't have inputs and outputs in the sense that inputs and outputs are static and you have an input and there's an output and then it stops. Now the system is constantly in dynamical motion. And then the second thing is developmental systems theory, which is the idea that the agent is a set of dynamic environmental loops that have evolved in time. Is a set of dynamic environmental loops that has evolved in time. So the history of interactions with the environment has shaped the way that the agent has found its niche in the environment. All right? The way that the agent interacts with the environment has shaped the way that the agent has found its niche in the environment. And the way that developmental systems theory is incorporated and invoked in the enactivist framework is that it is posited in contradistinction to what used to be the orthodoxy in biology, known as genocentrism, the idea that there is a strict separation between the somatic line and the germ line in the body, where all of genetic transmission occurs through the germ line, not the somatic line. This is known as the Weismann doctrine, right? The strict segregation of the germ and somatic cells, where all inheritance is strictly genetic, and somatic line produced by genes is produced by the genes, but not vice versa. And the unit of replication is the gene, so that the entire body and information processing and all the meaning that the agent experiences is just a proxy. It's just a proxy for genes replicating themselves, right? It's just a proxy for genes surviving and then genes moving on to survive elsewhere. All right, so that's genocentrism in rudimentary form. And developmental systems theory opposes or tries to dull this view of things that it is just the genes that are replicators, but rather it dulls that segregation between the somatic and the germ lines by saying that there is epigenetic factors that influence genetic transmission, and two, that it isn't just the genes that are the replicators, but rather the entire phenotypic expression is the whole that gets replicated. All right, so the phenotypic expression is not relegated to just as a proxy, right? But it is the means through which the organism, or rather, is the meaningful interface with the world through which the agent is determined to be viable or not, essentially.